September 19, 1944, Sturbeek, Netherlands. Private First Class John McKnight crouches behind a shattered brick wall as German machine gun fire tears through the morning fog. The hollow, metallic click of his M1 Carbine signals a desperate reality that has plagued American infantry since the early hours of the invasion. He has burned through 6 15-round magazines in less than 3 minutes. The Wehrmacht soldiers are still advancing, maneuvering around his flanks, forcing McKnight to stop fighting at the very moment he needs firepower the most. This is the fatal flaw of the American arsenal in the fall of 1944. The M1 Carbine, a revolutionary lightweight weapon designed for officers and support troops, is failing the test of sustained urban combat. In the brutal, close-quarters fighting of Operation Market Garden, the standard 15-round magazine equates to perhaps 10 seconds of sustained fire. Once the bolt locks back, the soldier enters the most dangerous window of time in modern warfare. To get back in the fight, a paratrooper must drop the empty magazine, reach into a pouch, fumble for a fresh one, insert it into the well, and chamber a round. In training, this is a smooth motion, but under the extreme stress of combat, the process drags out to between 6 and 8 seconds. Against German defensive positions equipped with MG-42 machine guns firing 1,200 rounds per minute, an 8-second gap is not merely a pause, it is a death sentence where the soldier cannot return fire and remains completely vulnerable. The Army Ordnance Department in Washington was well aware of this deficiency. Reports from Normandy indicated that carbine-equipped soldiers expended ammunition 43% faster than anticipated. Their solution, however, was a triumph of bureaucratic disconnect. They simply ordered paratroopers to carry more magazines. In July 1944, the standard load increased from 6 magazines to 10. But adding weight does not solve the problem of time. 10 loaded magazines add over 3 pounds to a paratrooper already burdened with chutes, grenades, and rations. Having 150 rounds on a belt is useless if a soldier is overrun while trying to load the first 15 into the gun, because the real issue isn't how much ammunition a soldier carries, but how fast he can empty it. While the experts in Washington debated loadout weights, men like McKnight were dying in that fatal 8-second gap. What McKnight didn't know as he slammed another magazine home in the mud of Sturbeek was that the solution to his problem wasn't coming from the Pentagon. It was sitting on a workbench 200 miles away in Liège, Belgium, devised by a 23-year-old clerk with no engineering degree. It was crude, unauthorized, and according to every regulation in the Army's technical manual, completely illegal.
To understand why American paratroopers were dying in the Netherlands in September 1944, one must look beyond the chaos of battle to the cold hard arithmetic of infantry design. The M1 Carbine entered service in 1942 as a revolutionary compromise intended to bridge the gap between a pistol and a full battle rifle. It was lightweight, manageable, and by 1944, the Army had manufactured over 2.6 million of them, making it the second most common weapon in the American arsenal. For officers, truck drivers, and radio operators, it was perfect, but for the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne dropped into the close-quarters nightmare of Market Garden, the carbine's design contained a mathematical inequality that favored the enemy. The core of the problem lay in the disparity between ammunition capacity and reload mechanics. The standard M1 Carbine magazine held just 15 rounds. In the hedgerows of France and the brick streets of Dutch towns, firefights were sustained engagements lasting minutes, not seconds. A paratrooper carrying the standard load of 6 magazines entered combat with 90 rounds total. Against German defensive positions anchored by MG-42 machine guns, weapons capable of cyclic rates exceeding 1,200 rounds per minute, the American soldier was consistently outgunned. The mathematics of suppression fire meant that while an American paratrooper was frantically trying to keep his head down, the Germans could saturate his position with a volume of fire that made movement impossible. However, the real killer wasn't the capacity, it was the interval. The true vulnerability of the M1 Carbine was revealed when compared to the M1 Garand carried by regular infantry. A rifleman with a Garand could fire 8 rounds and reload with a single en bloc clip in under 3 seconds, maintaining a near constant stream of fire. The carbine soldier, conversely, had to perform a complex motor sequence, remove the empty magazine, retrieve a fresh one from a pouch, insert it, chamber around, and resume firing. Under the trembling stress of mortal combat, this process took 6 to 8 seconds. In that 6 to 8 second window, the soldier is effectively unarmed, unable to return fire, and completely vulnerable. Ordnance experts had attempted to solve this with brute force engineering. In August 1944, Springfield Armory tested a prototype 25-round magazine, hoping to extend the firing duration. The experiments failed. The longer magazines extended too far below the weapon, catching on harnesses and equipment during jumps. Worse, the carbine's magazine well wasn't designed for the additional spring tension required to feed 25 rounds reliably against gravity, leading to constant feeding problems. The consensus from the experts was absolute. The M1 Carbine was a 15-round weapon. If soldiers needed more firepower, they were told they should carry the heavier M1 Garand or the Browning automatic rifle. But this advice ignored the physical reality of airborne operations. At 9.5 pounds empty, the Garand was deemed too heavy for the initial jump load in many units, and the bar, weighing nearly 20 pounds, was a squad support weapon, not a personal rifle. Paratroopers were effectively stuck with the carbine. The consequences of this rigidity were documented in the blood of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's analysis noted that carbine-equipped soldiers expended their ammunition reserves 43% faster than anticipated in training. During the Battle of Carentan, 3 entire companies reported running critically low on ammunition within the first hour of engagement. They were fighting against the mathematics of their own equipment, and by September 1944, they were losing.
Technical Sergeant David Marshall was not an engineer, nor was he a weapons designer. He was a 23-year-old administrative clerk from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, serving in the headquarters of the 29th Ordnance Battalion in Liège, Belgium. His qualification for the Army wasn't a degree from MIT, but the fact that his father owned a hardware store back home, and a recruiter had once noted that the Army needed men who understood tools. While the war raged across Europe, Marshall's war was fought with filing cabinets. His daily existence consisted of processing requisition forms, tracking serial numbers, and filing reports about weapon malfunctions that were destined to be forwarded to the Springfield Armory and likely never read again. But Marshall had a peculiar habit that distinguished him from every other clerk in the battalion. He actually read the reports. By September 1944, he had reviewed 147 specific malfunction reports related to the M1 Carbine. As he parsed the dry military language, he noticed a disturbing pattern. The weapons weren't suffering from mechanical breakage, they were suffering from tactical failure. Soldiers weren't reporting that the gun jammed, they were reporting that they were running empty in the middle of firefights. The complaints were almost always about magazine capacity, revealing a disconnect between the weapon's design and the reality of combat. His moment of clarity arrived on September 18th, the second day of Operation Market Garden. A batch of damaged carbines arrived at the depot from the 82nd Airborne, and among the twisted metal, Marshall found a weapon that had been modified in the field. A desperate soldier had attempted to tape 2 15-round magazines together end to end to speed up his reload. The tape had failed, and the magazines had fallen apart, but the intent was unmistakable. Marshall realized the soldier wasn't trying to solve a capacity problem, but a time problem. If you couldn't carry more rounds in the gun, you had to eliminate the time it took to find the next magazine. That night, Marshall lay awake until 3 a.m., turning the problem over in his mind. Taping them end to end made the assembly too long and fragile. The answer, he realized, was to attach them side by side, but inverted. When one magazine ran dry, the soldier would simply hit the release, pull the assembly out, flip it 180 degrees, and insert the fresh magazine. No fumbling in pouches, no taking eyes off the enemy. Just pull, flip, insert. 2 seconds instead of 8. Marshall sat up in his bunk, realizing the simplicity of the solution. However, Marshall faced a wall that was harder to breach than the Siegfried Line. Army Regulation 758. This regulation explicitly forbade the unauthorized modification of standard issue equipment. Any alteration to a weapons configuration required formal approval from Ordnance Corps headquarters in Washington, a bureaucratic process that took months. Marshall knew that if he submitted a suggestion as a clerk, it would be ignored. If he modified the magazines himself, he would be court-martialed. But soldiers were dying now.
On September 20th, Marshall walked to the maintenance shed behind the depot, an area technically off-limits to administrative personnel. He was looking for Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a machinist from Pittsburgh who owed him a favor. Marshall had previously lost a requisition form that would have implicated Kowalski in an unauthorized repair of a colonel's Jeep. Marshall called in the debt. He showed Kowalski a sketch of a metal clip that would hold two magazines together, inverted. Kowalski, looking at the drawing, immediately recognized the legal peril. He pointed out that this wasn't just modification. Under Article 108, it constituted the destruction of government property, a court-martial offense. Marshall countered that the magazines weren't being destroyed, but enhanced, and that this wasn't for personal use, but for field testing. Despite his skepticism, the engineering challenge piqued the machinist's curiosity. Using scrap metal from damaged equipment, Kowalski worked after hours for 3 days to fabricate a curved piece of spring steel that gripped two magazines at their midpoint. On September 23rd, the two conspirators met behind the maintenance shed to test their felony. Marshall loaded one magazine with dummy rounds, left the other empty, and inserted the assembly into a test carbine. He fired until the bolt locked back. He pulled the magazine, rotated the clip, and slammed the fresh one home. The motion was awkward at first, but by the third try it was fluid. 2 seconds. They stood in the cold air, looking at the device that could save thousands of lives, but could also send them to prison. "That's illegal as hell," Kowalski said. "I know," Marshall replied. They made 6 more that night. By late September 1944, Technical Sergeant Marshall had a working prototype and a viable manufacturing process, but he faced a logistical dead end that was far more daunting than any engineering challenge: distribution. He could not simply hand out unauthorized equipment to combat units without raising immediate red flags that would lead directly to a court-martial. To get these clips into the hands of the men who needed them, he required an officer to legitimize the field testing. He found his accomplice in Captain James Hendricks, the battalion's supply officer. Hendricks was an anomaly in the rigid structure of the Army. He was a 34-year-old former high school teacher from Baltimore who entered the war through officer candidate school rather than the academy. He was not a career soldier obsessed with protocol. He was a practical man willing to bend the rules if it meant keeping his men alive. On September 26th, Marshall approached Hendricks with 2 of the modified magazines and a typed report documenting the results of their secret testing. He presented the math clearly. The reload time was reduced from 8 seconds to 2 seconds, representing a 75% decrease in the time a soldier was vulnerable to enemy fire. Hendricks listened to the pitch and looked at the illegal modifications sitting on his desk. He understood the implications immediately. He looked at Marshall and delivered the hard truth of their situation, stating that if the device worked, he would be the officer who authorized unauthorized modifications to military property, and that would be the end of his career. Marshall, however, had come prepared with more than just engineering data. He had the grim statistics of the battlefield. He countered Hendricks's hesitation with the devastating fact from the after-action reports of the 82nd Airborne. 47 men had died in defensive positions specifically while trying to reload their carbines. He asked the captain a simple moral question: if this modification could save even one of those lives, wasn't it worth the risk? Hendricks stared at the magazines for a long moment, weighing his pension against the lives of strangers before giving his order. He told Marshall to make 50 clips and promised to get them to the 58th Parachute Infantry, adding that if anyone asked, he would take the heat. Marshall and the machinist, Frank Kowalski, worked through the nights for 4 days, fabricating the clips from scrap metal and damaged magazine springs, but the operation hit a catastrophic wall on October 3, 1944, when Major Robert Pearson from Ordnance Corps headquarters in Paris arrived at the battalion for a routine inspection. Pearson was the antithesis of Hendricks. He was a West Point graduate, a career Army man, and a rigid stickler for regulations who viewed the Army manual as sacred scripture. While inspecting the maintenance shed to ensure compliance with modification protocols, Pearson discovered Kowalski's workbench, which was littered with 3 partially completed clips and Marshall's original sketches. The subsequent confrontation in the battalion commander's office was less a meeting than an indictment. Pearson summoned Hendricks and Marshall to stand before Lieutenant Colonel William Bradford, the battalion commander. Bradford was 51 years old, a career logistics officer who had spent most of the war managing supply chains behind the lines. He was known as a cautious, risk-averse man who was close to retirement and unlikely to rock the boat.
Pearson was furious, verbally flaying Captain Hendricks for authorizing unauthorized modifications to standard-issue equipment and distributing them without approval from the Ordnance Corps. When Hendricks argued that the device improved combat effectiveness, Pearson famously retorted that he didn't care if the modification made the carbine shoot lightning bolts. The captain did not have the authority to modify military equipment.
It was here that the hierarchy of the U.S. Army was momentarily inverted. Marshall, a lowly administrative clerk, interrupted a field-grade officer to speak in his own defense. "Major, with respect," he began, noting that the modification had already been field-tested by the 58th Parachute Infantry. He handed Pearson a folder containing a letter from Private First Class John McKnight. McKnight had used the prototype during a German counterattack on September 29th, firing 180 rounds in sustained defense and crediting the device with saving his life and the lives of 4 other men. Pearson refused to even open the folder. He dismissed Marshall's evidence, stating that Marshall was merely a clerk with no engineering credentials or weapons design experience, and therefore the entire operation was invalid. The room erupted into an argument, with Hendricks insisting on field necessity and Pearson insisting that regulations existed for a reason. The tension in the room was absolute until Colonel Bradford, the cautious logistics officer, finally spoke. Bradford looked at the major and asked a question that cut through the bureaucratic noise. "If this modification is saving lives, don't we have an obligation to evaluate it properly?" Pearson's jaw tightened as he explained that the proper evaluation process required submission to Springfield Armory for safety testing, a process that would take months. Hendricks quietly pointed out the obvious consequence. Then men will die during those months. Bradford made a decision that defined his career. He looked at the angry major and announced that he was authorizing continued field testing under his own authority as battalion commander. He promised to submit a formal request for review, but in the meantime, Hendricks was to continue distribution. When Pearson threatened to note this decision in his inspection report and warned that the colonel was taking full responsibility for the consequences, Bradford didn't blink. "I am," he said. It was a polite, bureaucratic mutiny. Bradford was risking his pension and his reputation for a piece of scrap metal because a clerk had convinced him it was the right thing to do. The true validation of Marshall's invention did not occur in a sterile testing lab at the Springfield Armory, but on a frozen, fog-bound ridge in the Netherlands, where the mathematics of survival were calculated in blood. By mid-October 1944, Marshall had managed to distribute 347 of his modified magazine sets to 6 different airborne units operating in the theater. Almost immediately, the reports filtering back to the 29th Ordnance Battalion began to show statistical anomalies that confused the standard logisticians. Lieutenant Thomas Richardson of the 504th Parachute Infantry reported that his soldiers were maintaining 73% higher rates of sustained fire during defensive actions. Even more baffling to the supply officers was the report from Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 500O, who noted that his squad's overall ammunition consumption had actually decreased. This seemed counterintuitive. If soldiers could shoot faster, surely they would waste more bullets. But the modification had altered the psychology of the engagement. Soldiers were no longer panic firing, dumping their magazines in a frantic burst to empty the gun before they hit the reload gap. Knowing the next 15 rounds were instantly available, they slowed down. They took aim. They made their shots count. However, statistics on a requisition form are abstract. The visceral proof of the concept arrived on November 16, 1944 at Groesbeek Heights. Staff Sergeant William Patterson led a small 12-man patrol from the 58th Parachute Infantry through the frozen woods east of the town. Their objective was a partially destroyed farmhouse on a low ridge that offered a commanding view of the German supply routes near the Reichswald forest. Patterson and 6 of his men were equipped with M1 carbines featuring Marshall's illegal coupled magazines. They established a defensive perimeter around the farmhouse and settled in to observe, unaware that they were about to become the subjects of a lethal case study in small unit tactics. At 07:23 a.m., the silence of the morning was shattered when a German patrol stumbled onto their position. This was not a ragged unit of conscripts. It was a platoon of 37 men from the 6th Fausamgia Regiment, battle-hardened German paratroopers who were conducting their own reconnaissance. The arithmetic of the engagement was terrifyingly simple. The Americans were outnumbered 3-1. In a standard engagement, the Germans would have utilized their superior numbers to suppress the smaller American force, waiting for the inevitable lull in fire that signaled the Americans were reloading. That silence was the signal to advance, to rush the gaps in the line and overrun the position. When the German paratroopers spotted the Americans, they launched an immediate aggressive assault. Patterson's men opened fire. And this is where the German tactical playbook fell apart. Patterson fired his first 15 rounds at the advancing gray shapes, and instead of ducking down to fumble for a fresh magazine, he simply dropped the empty assembly, flipped it, and slammed the fresh side home. The motion took less than 2 seconds. Before the echo of his last shot had faded, he was firing again. To the German attackers, the volume of fire coming from the farmhouse was inexplicable. They were listening for the pauses, the metallic clicks, the shouts of "reloading" that would mark their window of opportunity. But the window never opened. Every time the Fallschirmjäger attempted to exploit a perceived gap, they were met with a continuous wall of sustained carbine fire. The Americans were putting rounds downrange with a rhythm that suggested a much larger force. The firefight raged for 11 minutes. In that short, violent span of time, Patterson's patrol fired 847 rounds. When the smoke cleared, the German assault had been shattered. The surviving Germans retreated, leaving 23 of their men killed or wounded on the frozen ground. Inside the farmhouse, the American casualty count was miraculous: 2 wounded, none killed. The confusion of the enemy provided the ultimate validation of Marshall's work. 3 days after the engagement, Lieutenant Hans Becker, the German patrol leader who had survived the assault, was captured and interrogated. His statement was recorded in the intelligence report, offering a rare glimpse into the contrast principle from the other side of the barrel. Becker told his interrogators, "We expected the Americans to have the usual carbines, 15 rounds, then they reload, then we advance. But these Americans, they never stopped firing." He described the sensation of the battle as fighting against men who possessed automatic weapons that fired with the accuracy of single shots. When the interrogator showed the captured officer one of the modified magazine assemblies, Becker studied the crude piece of spring steel carefully. His reaction was a mixture of professional respect and frustration. "This is very clever, very simple. Why did it take the Americans so long to think of this?" By December 1944, the anomaly at Groesbeck Heights had been replicated across the theater. Marshall's modification was now in use by 2,407 soldiers across 3 different airborne divisions. The data was no longer anecdotal, it was undeniable. The average reload time for a carbine-equipped soldier had dropped from 7.3 seconds to 1.8 seconds. The sustained fire capability had effectively doubled from 15 rounds to 30 rounds before a soldier needed to access his pouches. Most significantly, casualty rates in defensive positions where soldiers were previously overrun during reload gaps had decreased by 31%. The military is an institution built on numbers, but David Marshall, the clerk who started it all, knew that every number represented a human life. The Army's own analysis later estimated that the modification saved 127 lives between October and December 1944 alone. One of those lives belonged to Private First Class John McKnight, the soldier who had first inspired the idea. McKnight survived the war and later wrote to Marshall, "I fired 180 rounds in maybe 4 minutes. I never had to take my eyes off the enemy. We held the position. All 5 of us survived." The hardware clerk had not just solved a mechanical problem, he had rewritten the mathematics of survival for thousands of men. The wheels of bureaucracy eventually caught up to the reality of the battlefield, but as is often the case in war, they turned with agonizing slowness. It wasn't until January 12, 1945, nearly 4 months after Marshall's unauthorized experiments began, that Springfield Armory formally approved the modification for field use. The approval came with a typical administrative caveat. The modification was authorized, but not required, leaving the decision to adopt it up to individual unit commanders. By March 1945, the industrial might of the United States finally engaged with the concept. The Rock Island Arsenal produced 47,000 official magazine coupling clips based directly on Marshall's design. However, for the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne who had fought through the frozen hell of the Ardennes, this validation arrived too late. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, meaning the official issue clips saw limited service in the theater where they were born. Yet the war was global, and Marshall's invention found a new life in the Pacific. As fighting continued against Imperial Japan until August, the modified magazines saw extensive use. Marines and Army infantry fighting in the mud and caves of Okinawa reported the exact same benefits that the paratroopers had discovered in the Netherlands: faster reloads, sustained fire capability, and a critical increase in confidence while holding defensive positions. When the dust settled and the Army conducted a formal review of field modifications developed during the war, the significance of Marshall's work was finally cemented in the archives. Out of thousands of ad hoc inventions created by desperate soldiers, Marshall's magazine coupling system was one of only 7 officially adopted for permanent use. It was given a sterile official designation in the supply catalogs: Magazine Coupling Clip M1 Carbine Type 1. The distribution of credit, however, followed the strict hierarchy of rank rather than the truth of innovation. In May 1945, Captain James Hendricks, the officer who had risked his career to authorize the initial testing, was awarded the Bronze Star. The citation praised his meritorious service through the development and implementation of field modifications. Technical Sergeant David Marshall, the man who actually conceived the idea, engineered the prototype, and manufactured the initial batches, received no medals. His name did not appear in the official histories, which credited the invention generically to field development by forward ordnance units. To his credit, Captain Hendricks never accepted the accolade as solely his own. Years later, when asked about the Bronze Star, he admitted the truth with quiet integrity. "The Bronze Star was for both of us. Marshall couldn't receive it because he wasn't an officer, so I accepted it on his behalf." The Army had validated the medal, but it had overlooked the man. David Marshall received no medals. His name appears in no official histories of the war. When Springfield Armory finally codified his invention, they credited it to field development by forward ordnance units, stripping the individual of his achievement. Marshall didn't seem to care. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of technical sergeant and returned immediately to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to take over his father's hardware store. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and settled into a quiet, unremarkable life. For decades, he never spoke about the war, and he certainly never mentioned that he had redesigned the U.S. Army's standard infantry weapon in a shed in Belgium. His family remained completely unaware of his contribution until 1982, nearly 40 years later. A customer walked into the hardware store, a Korean War veteran, and happened to mention how coupled magazines had saved his squad during a patrol in the 1950s. Marshall's son, who was working the counter, overheard the conversation and later pressed his father for details. "Did you have something to do with those coupled magazines?" he asked. Marshall simply shrugged. He said, "I made some clips during the war. They seemed to help. That's it." When his son asked why he never claimed credit for an invention that had clearly saved lives, Marshall gave an answer that defined his generation. It wasn't about recognition. It was about soldiers coming home. That's all that mattered. David Marshall died in 1997 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette was modest, noting his military service in a single sentence: "David served in the Army during World War II." But while his name faded, his logic endured. In military archives, in after-action reports from Korea and Vietnam, and in the training manuals of modern special operations forces, the ghost of his modification lives on. In Vietnam, soldiers taped M16 magazines together. Today, Navy SEALs and Army Rangers utilize commercially manufactured magazine couplers that are the direct descendants of the scrap metal Marshall bent into shape. Most of the soldiers who use these devices today have no idea where the concept came from. They don't know about the clerk who couldn't sleep, the machinist who risked a court-martial, or the colonel who chose men over regulations.
But Marshall's story teaches us something profound about the nature of innovation. It reminds us that the most important solutions often come from the most unlikely sources, from the people who are willing to look at a problem and ignore the rulebook that says, you can't do that. 127 men came home in 1944 because a hardware store owner from Iowa decided that saving lives was more important than following orders. Marshall proved that sometimes the solution isn't impossible, it's just illegal.